I think the question that animates a lot of my work is just like, why do people do the things they do? Like what would compel people to make a hyper realistic model of a blue whale? Like um, what is this gargantuan effort for? And so sort of researching that in the way that historians do, you go through archives. Um, and I found this slip of papers asking for the cast of David Kahanamoku, a copy of the cast of David Kahanamoku to be sent to the Peabody Museum at Yale. And so it's pretty rare. It's relatively rare in certainly in like museum like sculptures to have people named explicitly. Like you might have the mannequin of whatever sort of well back in the 1920s would have been the mannequin of whatever racial type or something like that, but really rare to hear someone named. And so this is in the era of Google, so I could Google this person. It turned out to be the brother of Duke Kahanamoku, who's just sort of it's called the godfather of surfing. He's the person who's most often credited with having introduced surfing to the mainstream United States. Of course, people had been surfing for thousands of years before him, and he wasn't actually the first person to surf on the mainland. But he's certainly the person who's like, you talk to any surfer, they know who Duke Kahanamoku is, and he's like ground zero for surfing. Um, so I just got really fascinated. I was like, what do these anthropologists do? And taking a full body cast, covering Duke Kahanamoku's brother with plaster. Um, and so I just as kind of like the whale, it's like, why would someone do this? One thing is that, as I started to dig into, so I found this slip of paper, and then as I started to dig into the whole casting of David Kahanamoku, I discovered that there's this sort of um, cadre, a clique of anthropologists at the Museum of Natural History, sort of led by Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was the president of the museum at the time, who's not an anthropologist, he's a paleontologist, but sort of a all-purpose sort of all-purpose natural scientist. And so this clique of anthropologists had led by Osborne had sort of become obsessed with like surfers and surfing as like paragons of masculinity. And so one of the things that was sort of shocking to me was you sort of read all their letters and they're writing back and forth and they're discussing like the surfers' glistening pectorals and their beautiful thighs and all this stuff that you don't really expect to hear from these buttoned up 1920s guys. And so of course I had to delve into why. And so I guess the fastest way into why why these anthropologists were so obsessed with surfers and surfing and Hawaii was because by the 1920s, Hawaii was this sort of crossroads of the Pacific, right? So it was really only recently had been incorporated, like within the past 20 years, had been incorporated into the U.S. as a territory. Prior to that, it had been an independent kingdom, and actually it had sort of been overthrown by basically by a coup led by these American and British businessmen who were sort of sugar magnates on the island. Um, and one of the controversial parts of this was that the U.S. military had sort of inadvertently taken part in the coup without sort of the permission of the United States government. So there's a lot of controversy sort of right around the turn of the century as to like, well, should Hawaii actually be a part of the United States at all? Like, did we not just kind of like randomly overthrow an independent kingdom and so many people were quite opposed to this, but um, the way things worked out by the 1920s, Hawaii was this sort of outpost in the Pacific of American empire. And what's more, it was a multiracial outpost. So there were, of course, indigenous Hawaiian people living on the island, although because of disease, mainly, the numbers of indigenous Hawaiian people living in Hawaii had dwindled from like something like high estimates are like in around 1 million at the time of contact with Europeans, had dwindled down to like somewhere in the 40 to 20,000 range by the 1920s. Um, and so, okay, so we have some indigenous Hawaiians living there. We have Chinese laborers, we have Portuguese laborers, we have Japanese people, like, so there's like all these people are, Black Americans, white Americans, Germans, all these people are living in Hawaii. And if you are a anthropologist, and in fact, if you're an anthropologist, if you're a physical anthropologist in the United States in the 1920s, you're likely as not, you're also a eugenicist, and we can get to what that means in a minute. But you're really interested in the question of race mixing. What does it mean when like two races mix? Like, will their offspring be better or worse, or like what does that mean for society? And so here you have Hawaii, which is this from the perspective of these anthropologists, is this place where race mixing is taking place all over the place. Races live side by side, um, and seemingly society functions well. It's not, if you're a eugenicist, you probably believe that race mixing leads to the collapse of society. And here you have Hawaiian society as functioning well. And so part of the obsession was like, well, how is it that not only that you have this well-functioning little insular society. But you even have men like Duke Kahanamoku, who are these like splendid examples of humanity that science needs to study. Um, and so I should say, so that was the perspective of the 1920s. That's why the anthropologists were so interested. Um, and I think what was really interesting to me about this story was not so much what the anthropologists were seeing, although that is uh, sort of interested in a kind of distorted way, but also kind of everything that they were missing because at the same time in the 1920s, like while they're sort of worried about things like racial form and all this, we can talk more about what goes into eugenics. They're sort of missing the birth of this whole new culture, which we'd come to call surf culture, right? So um, even while they're only interested in body type, at the same time we have guys like Duke Kahanamoku who are they're popularizing surfing. They invented the concept of the beach boy at the time. So they're um, the idea that you could like sort of make money teaching tourists how to surf and fish and do all this stuff. They're these guys are interested in film, like they're into music. Um, None of this stuff really seems to cross the and Honolulu is this like rich bustling port. I mean, there's lots of like, I mean, of course, there's lots of the usual sort of like port labor, people like offloading and onloading steamers. There's tourists everywhere. There's a thriving opium trade. So, you've got, but all this was sort of lost on the anthropologists who are just like strictly focused on this, the sort of human type. Well, one aspect of the story is that this guy Osborne, the president of the Museum of Natural History, one of the reasons why he becomes so fixated on surfing and surfers in particular is he goes to Hawaii to sort of do some preliminary like scouting around to see like well like can we have a project about race science in Hawaii, like should we fund this, and he ends up taking a surfing lesson from Duke Kahanamoku, which is not uncommon at the time, right? Because this is how Duke Kahanamoku makes his money. Basically, he's um, if you're if you're a Hawaiian dude living around Honolulu, which is sort of the most bustling of the ports at the time, basically your choices are limited. Like you can work at the pineapple canning factory and um, make barely enough to scrape by, or if you're a guy like Duke, who's at this point a celebrated surfer and swimmer, you can make $5 on a single surfing lesson, which is a lot. You can make $1,000 in a season. So like, so here he is. Yeah, so he and his friends, he and his the sort of his gang are like they're beach boys, they're hustlers, and so they're always giving tourists surfing lessons. He gives a surfing lesson to Osborne, who's like, oh my gosh, these there's this man who's like uh, beautiful, statuesque. It seems to maybe even be like this is what humanity used to be like, is what Osborne thinks. Like before we had like civilization, which civilization in the minds of eugenicists is kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's great because you get big cities, you get like you conquer nature or whatever. You conquer nature, you conquer other people. On the other hand, though, there's a fear in the 1920s that civilization is making white people in particular soft. Like where there's this idea that like some people like Theodore Roosevelt would say, oh, we used to be hunters and frontiersmen, but now we spend all our time, sitting at desks and worrying about stock numbers and our accounts and stuff like this, and that's leading our bodies and our genes to degenerate. So people like Roosevelt and to a lesser extent Osborne are advocates of this idea that like to get the white race back up to snuff, we got to like do strenuous things. You got to like go out and hunt bears or surf, right? Which is what people like Jack London would say, like, like surfing is a really good way you confront nature. And, anyway, they see, you see a guy like Duke Kahanamoku, who's this like perfect specimen of humanity, and they're like, oh, this is what humans used to be like, and he's this way um, because he surfs. Yeah, so the goal of the project was to get a cast of David Kahanamoku for and his marvelous physique for the Museum of Natural History. The nice thing about casts is that you could also like make multiples of them. So I think their plan was to, maybe if they get this great cast, they could sell casts to other museums. Um, so they, so yeah, they have this plan, and it seems like, I mean, basically their plan, they just kept saying, hey, like, why don't you come by the museum sometime? Like, so like when Duke would come through New York, for instance, on the way back home from the Olympics, they were like, hey, why don't you come through the museum? We'll just measure you. Maybe we'll take some photos, maybe take a cast or something like that. Wouldn't that be great? Um, and by and large, he was just not interested. Like by all evidence, like they were, sort of. And they tried to get him in New York. They tried to get him in Waikiki, and so you have this sort of almost comical sort of period of where Duke just seems to be evading these eugenicists, like as they sort of like chase him around Hawaii, trying to get him to make a cast. Um, and so he was not interested because of the subject matter. I mean, the eugenicists did kind of they kind of understood that what they were doing was creepy, like to put it lightly. And so they were, and you can see this in their letters back and forth. They're sort of talking about like, yeah, you have to be really circumspect when you're, you can't really be emphasizing this whole like, racial superiority thing because, people who are non-white don't like that. For obvious reasons. So the people that they're measuring and they're casting and they do other casts too, I should say. They do they cast other people that they mainly not full body casts, but just like face casts. Um, they do this with other people that they meet. But yeah, they have to be really circumspect about that. Ultimately, what seems to have happened, and this is circumstantial, but you can sort of piece the pieces together is certainly eventually the governor, the incoming territorial governor of Hawaii, sort of leans on Duke and says like, as a favor to Osborne, I should say Osborne was um, he wasn't just a scientist, he was also sort of one of these independently wealthy, you know, uh, descendant of robber barons. So he was sort of well hooked up in the sort of political the world of politics and plutocracy of the 1920s. Um, the territorial governor leans on Duke to, says, listen, you've just got to go do this cast. Seems like he might have like also like there might have been some like financial incentive, like, listen, I'll give you this job as an official greeter if you'll just do me this favor kind of thing. Um, and so Duke agrees, and at the last minute, he sends his brother David in his place. And so, you know, and I had the real pleasure of talking to David Kahanamoku's son, who said that he said this isn't too uncommon. So it was often like, Duke is the oldest, David is the second oldest, and oftentimes, the whole family would throw their support behind the oldest brother. So, like David was kind of taking a hit for Duke. And so, eventually David went and did the cast, and had such an awful experience that he was like, no family member of mine is ever going through this. And so at that point, they called the whole thing off. But they did get a sculpture of David Kahanamoku, who's physically his physical appearance and his build were a lot like Duke's, and they then went and put this sculpture as like one of the centerpieces of the 1921 International Eugenics Congress. So all these eugenicists could then go and say like, aha, this is what humanity in its primitive form should be. I think a lot of the ways that eugenicists thought are still sort of like, there's one narrative. So maybe just for your listeners, like, so, eugenics, the term comes from, the idea of good generation. So it's basically the idea that like through mainly legal, but also cultural pressures, we can sort of shape the gene pool of society to make better humans, right? And so in the 20s, when there wasn't such a good understanding of genes, genetics came down mainly to race, and so there was an idea that different races have different, um, different properties that make them better or worse members of society. So, what's a good example? I mean, often this could be quite, you know, often this is so often it can be quite minute. So like there's this one eugenicist writes these very detailed descriptions of what each race is like, and he goes down to saying that like Germans have the German race has a love of songbirds or something like that, and you're like, well, I mean, that seems hard to substantiate, but they had just this sort of immense confidence that everything could be explained by genes. Race was a proxy of genes, and so the idea would be, um, figure out which races are best for society, and make sure those races prosper, and the races that are notionally not good for society don't prosper. Of course, all this, the United States is the world leader in eugenics, for the early 20th century. Um, the Third Reich in Germany, starting in 1933, it sort of looks at the United States and they're like, that's, these guys are doing it right. Let's, let's let's grab a piece of that. Actually, they sort of chillingly, the Third Reich actually says like the United States has the best sort of race science. They're like, I don't think we could actually get Germans behind this. I think that Germans are too independent minded. Ultimately, of course, this leads to the final solution, the Holocaust, World War II. And this is when, so a lot of people would say that like eugenics is pretty discredited after 1945. But there are reverberations for the ways that eugenicists were thinking in society. Like we still default a lot to thinking about race and genes as defining human types. Um, it was actually just this past week was sort of in this like lengthy discussion with a bunch of geneticists. Some of whom were very much like, well, no, actually, we'll say like genes and race really do correspond to intelligence. Like we now have scientific proof. Um, I, I I don't see much evidence for that, and other geneticists are like, no, actually, like not at all. Like the correlation, it's this correlation, not causation. So suffice to say, the questions that eugenicists were asking are still in the air. So in one way, so that's an unexpected thing because I had sort of thought when I started researching that uh, these questions were more modulated than they had been. The other but the other way, the sort of more historically interesting way, to me anyway, is that um, this project to sort of um, try to define like so try to define race and to sort of see how okay like let's definitively tell like see how race works. Ultimately, on the merits of empiricism in some ways collapsed in on itself. So the guy that Osborne sends to take the initial cast of Duke is this guy named Sullivan. He's a pretty hardcore eugenicist. He really believes that like races are pure, like there's pure aspect. He really believes that race can be defined in terms of like there are pure races, and each pure race has its own attributes and things like this, and that these attributes lead you to have lead different races to have different kinds of cultures, etc. But he dies in 1925, and his project is taken over by this other guy, Shapiro, um, who does the same kind of work but comes to the totally opposite conclusion. He's like, actually, if you really look, it's like people are fundamentally culturally similar all over not culturally similar, but um, have similar outlines to their cultures independent of race. People will, you know, all cultures think that some things are right and some things are wrong. They differ in what they think are right and wrong, but they all have codes of conduct, codes of manner, things that make them laugh, things that don't make them laugh. And of course, these things vary from culture to culture, but um, in very fundamental broad outlines, this guy Shapiro says that what's ultimately interesting is not the idea that every race has like just one culture, but that people make all sorts of cultures. So he comes up with not him alone, but he and other anthropologists come up with the idea of multiculturalism, which is of course what a familiar word now. And one of the ways we see this, and one of the fascinating things is that we see the emergence of something that's called surf culture, right? And so if you had said surf culture in the 1920s, I don't think people would have known what you meant. Like, what do you mean, like surf culture? Like either there's culture or there's not culture. There can't be like the thing within a culture. And so, one of the intriguing things is that this was sort of actually um, the real like either like light bulb or like just like sort of like little like mild mind blown moment was that like wow this project that starts with a fascination with the surfer actually ends up enabling the idea of surf culture that um, is comprehensible to people today. I think that uh, I can certainly speak about surf culture and people have different ideas about what it might be, right? Often it's like barefoot dudes who live on the beach or something like that, which it doesn't have to be, um, but yeah, so it eventually so this project sort of comes full circle and like leads to this sort of blossoming of the idea of what it means to be sort of a fully realized human in the world.